What's up, people? We're going to be checking out some tips and tricks today for Serum. Just some stuff I've picked up along the way over the years I've been producing. So this isn't specific to any type of bass or sound, but I think they're things that can help you if you're at a beginner level or an intermediate. They can help you conceptualize stuff about Serum more and can lead you perhaps to a quicker path of sound designing in a more efficient manner. So when we open up Serum, the first trick that I usually use, and you may have seen me say this, is if you're in Ableton and you're writing basses specifically, you want to draw them from C0 up to B0. So this octave here, this 0 octave, obviously you can go down a bit, you can go up. But generally what happens is if I draw, so typically drum and bass, for example, is written in F. I mean, I don't often write in F, but look, most people do. If I write an F0 there and I bring up a span, you see that the fundamental is down in the sub region there. Whereas if I was to write this up here, that has no sub. There is no sub in this sound. There is a first fundamental, there is a first harmonic. If you really want the sub, you do that. And what also happens is that means that we can just turn the sub on and we're drawing in sub, right? We don't have to mess around with the octaves here. So tip one is to, if you're writing basses specifically and they're going to be having sub in them, write somewhere in this 0 octave as you're in Ableton. I believe in FL Studio it's the 2 octaves, so you go 2 octaves higher in FL and you get the same effect. So the second thing, when we open up Serum here, the second thing would be, if you're trying to get a bass that has sort of grit in it, ideally you want to have sub mixed with a higher harmonic. Now, the higher harmonic is created in your wavetables. The sub, you can just use your sub for. So what I mean by that is, if I take a saw wave, for example, and I put it 2 octaves up, and I distort that, it just becomes a slightly louder, more distorted saw wave. But the second I turn the sub on, you'll hear as I run this into the distortion now. So distorting sub together with stuff is really a first step that I often take with basses, because you can then change the tonality of this. Now you could make this into a sine wave. See what a difference turning the sub on does, or what it makes. Now, second to this, depending on obviously the amount of distortion will affect how big and gritty it sounds, but the relationship between the level of your tonal sort of layer and the level of your sub will both determine how gritty or not the sound is. So, for example, if I turn the sub up and the oscillator down, it's a lot heavier and grittier, but there's less of a pronounced fundamental tone going on. Whereas if I bring this up and I bring the sub down, it becomes increasingly more tonal until we get to the point where we've completely removed the sub and we're back to square one. So, I'll keep bringing this down here because I know my head's up there. That would be number 2. Third one, quick one, I know for you new guys, just in case you don't know, always remember, if you're working with something that just has one unison here, so one copy, there's no voicing going on, always turn your random down. And also, because obviously what this does is it stops it from generating in new different spots, so your sound won't change its like tonality each time. But also, another tip that you can add on to that, which some people may not sort of remember too much, is that if you turn the random down and you play with where the phase actually starts every time, the tonality of your sound actually changes. So it's not that pronounced in like a sine wave, but if I go to a Monster 7, because there's such a difference from like the start to the end point of this wave, this tonality of your sound actually changes. So this and this, they're all the same sound essentially, but they're all the same wave. They're generating different sounds. So that's another tip for you guys. Moving on, When you are working with wavetables that have a changing wave, essentially, across the board of it, a good way to get variation in your sounds is to put an LFO on the wavetable, like this. And this is a really good way to get a sort of almost like a voice sounding thing happening. It's a really good way to make your sound a bit more natural. So definitely automating and changing the position of the wavetable over time is a good way to get variation in your sound from start to finish and make it sound less synthesized. Now I could take oscillator B here, make this sine wave, and put the level of oscillator A down. So now I'm just essentially, I have two subs, but if I move this up, now I got my fundamental. Sorry, my fundamental for my sub. And then I've also got the tonal fundamental there. And they're being distorted together. And then what I can do is I can level these and get them sounding pretty good. And then I can bring in some FM from A. Now you notice that we're getting change over time of the sound because the wavetable of the FM, the thing that's driving the FM, is changing. Now you'll see this is sort of what I showed you guys in the WOMP video, where you don't always have to modulate the amount of FM. That isn't always the sound you want, and you don't always have to modulate the level too. You can get a sound that sounds different and changes over time without modulating the level or the FM amount, or even the filter. And that's all just by using the wavetable there. See, if I don't do anything, it sounds very synthesized. Now obviously we're going to put some compression on. Put some hyper and stuff on. And this leads us to my next tip, where there's a few things that if you want to get width on your bass, but you don't want it to be width using the unison, which can cause a lot of phasing issues. Obviously, the idea with this is that we want to create effects that create spatial and stereo effects, but that don't affect the main sound too much, don't affect the fundamental. So we have a fully mono sound here. If I added that, you can see there's sides coming in. Now, usually we will compress, distort and compress. So let's say we got our sound here, kind of like where it's sitting. Maybe give it some movement on the filter. Maybe give it a bit of drive on the filter. Now, we now go into our effects. Usually the hyper, flanger, phaser, chorus, delay, and reverb, like these are all spatial effects. These all do things with the stereo field. So watch now as we add this. This is how we can add post-processing, but like while still in Serum, but just using the effects. We can add width instead of just relying on adding unison, which often doesn't translate to mono too well. So the first one is hyperdimension. Essentially what this does is it creates a detuned sort of stereo thing here. So you want to use this wisely and you want to use it carefully. We can see immediately that we start getting a little bit of side information coming in. So we maybe want to add the mix up a bit. We could do a lot of size and a small mix on the dimension too. And see, just like that, we've added a lot of stereo information. Another thing we can do is the phaser. A big tip for this, something that you might have seen before, is that if you turn the rate, depth, and frequency down, you get a guitar amp effect. You can even modulate that so it's a bit more tinny at the top and more ampy at the top, but like more warm at the bottom. And then tune that in. Some other stuff is obviously chorus. Now, one trick that you should consider with the chorus is turning this low pass filter to a high pass filter and then tuning it in so that anything below the frequency you set here isn't getting affected by the chorus, because we don't want as much stereo on the low end. Again, keep the mix low. Typically on these things, we're looking at somewhere between 7 to 15%, maybe even less on that one. It's just adding a little bit by little bit. Delay, we can add some stuff. So ping pong is typically what we would use for stereo. We would want it not to affect the whole frequency, so we want it to be further up. Bring the mix down a little bit. And then we'd probably want to link these and then change the BPM and reduce them. Now, this is essentially what creates the Haas effect, where you're repeating the sound straight after one another. But with ping pong, it definitely like sends it out to the sides. But you hear, and you can see we have a strong green mid signal there. The second we put the mix up, just completely overpowered. So again, a little bit of mix is all we want. Reverb, you can do the same thing. Now, on the filter, this is another tip that I like doing, is if you add a filter that is affected by your main LFO, so that's usually the same one you would use on your cutoff here, on your volumes, on your levels, and that sort of stuff. You can really clean the sound up once you've added a lot of processing to it. See, once we've added distortion, compression, we've added all these effects, it kind of gets uncontrolled again. So you can control it to really like dial into this shape that you want by adding a filter on the end. Now, if your filter's being used up, you can always use the EQ. Turn the Q down like that and adjust the frequency. And then that actually allows us to perhaps remove the modulation on that. And then we can add another tonal sort of texture effect. So we would want to go down to like the flanges and the miscellaneous ones. Just go through these, see how they affect it. Again, with no mix. Just go through it. I want to put the drive up a bit. See, basically the idea is that when you add on these filters, you may not know what they do. I don't know what these do. All I know is that when I change it from this to this, I'm getting a different tonality of the sound. Go down to the miscellaneous ones, add combs maybe. But again, you don't always have to add 100% mix. You might want to add more mix while you're checking what you want to do. So play around with those. Might want to add the EQ after so that it controls everything. Another tip is that you don't always have to add in all the high information in Serum, because if you're going to do post-processing, you might want to leave it like that. And then, in your post-processing, the first thing I would do is probably EQ this. And I could add on saturator or something and start to bring the high information out that way. But we won't get too much into post-processing. In terms of other stuff you can do in here, if we bring this back to initialized, if you're adding noise to a bass, like a simple noise bass, you would do something like this. We add a sub, we add a noise, maybe go bright white. Now, one good thing to remember is that noise is a full spectrum sound. It goes from lows all the way to the highs. People typically think of noise as being high end, but that's just because most samples and stuff, and when it's used in songs, it's high pass. Noise is actually a full spectrum sound. You'll see when I go here. So that's your sub, but your noise is going all the way down. So one thing that we might do, if we're trying to make a nice gritty sub layer with some noise on it, is that we add a filter, but we only affect the noise here. And we change this all the way so it goes to like a high pass. And then we can really dial in the tone. Make sure you turn on key tracking so it changes for the different notes. Notice how we're really carving up the noise there. And then we can use resonance to really like bring out a tone. Maybe use drive to level it. So then we can add the distortion. And then we start adjusting the tone more. You can even turn up the resonance fully so that you can hear the tone. I think that's a tone I like with this bass. So I'm going to bring it down. Maybe bring down the drive. Now we have a really nice saturated sub, noisy sub. Now you can add some effects to this. But obviously, you're going to cause a lot of phasing there, so be careful. You might want to do this in separate layers. That's another thing for you Ableton users, and obviously I know there'd be a way you can do this in FL, but you don't have to always just rely on one patch. I mean, if I like that, I could Control G or Command G and group that, and then Control D, and now I have two Serums. So now we have the same thing, but on this second one, perhaps instead of the sub and the noise, I add oscillator A and just make that like a Reese sort of thing. Give it some compression. Obviously it has distortion already. Bit of phaser. Maybe EQ a bit in the middle. And then I might want to high pass this one. I can do this in Serum or out. I mean, it's probably better to do it outside of Serum. Just chuck an EQ8 on top of that and remove the sub. And then you can level them against each other here. Because now what we're getting is we're getting a double layered sound, but we don't have to write two different channels for it. We're getting our sub with our noise, and then we're also getting our Reese sort of one. And you could do this again, you know? I could now add in So I don't want to make this video too long, but that was just some tips and tricks that I thought I'd give you guys. Just some random stuff that came to my head. There's obviously a lot more to Serum than that, but for some of you, it may just help spark some interest or remind you of certain features of Serum that can help you in your productions. I'll see you guys in the next video. Cheers.